This is Pretty Much Pop, a culture podcast covering only the hottest hits and the juiciest misses. Today, talking about the function and appreciation of cover songs. This is Mark Lintemeyer, whom you may be surprised to hear was originally, in my original form, a polka.
I'm Dave Hamilton. I am a podcaster and co-host of Gig Gab for working musicians. I'm a drummer, and I do all kinds of other things as well.
My name's Tim Quirk. I'm the front guy in a punk pop band called Too Much Joy. And a dude who's, I guess, a tech bro douche guy. Though I try not to be.
And the fellow whose work launched our topic today, PD. Introduce yourself. Say a little about this book you wrote.
I'm PD Magnus. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Albany, State University of New York. I'm a philosopher of science, and that includes, in my broad conception of science, the philosophy of cover songs. And so I wrote this recent book, A Philosophy of Cover Songs,
which I have read, but I have not expected my co-hosts here to have read. It's just to have more stuff to bring in. We all come with a large amount of baggage here. In fact, Dave and I, as I've told when you've been on the podcast in the past, were in a band together in the 90s, and we had to pick a bunch of cover songs. And so thinking about the way that we did that and which ones we bothered to do, which I think were mostly which ones were easiest.
Well, easiest is an ambiguous term, right? Because easiest for that band.
Yes, of course.
Right? The songs that fit us, but may not have been easy for any given band. But for that particular lineup and the way the four of us played music together, the covers that we picked worked for us. Like Elvis's Suspicious Minds was a cover that worked very well for us. It doesn't work very well for many cover bands, but it worked for us because of our skills or lack thereof. And one of the things you asked was, there was something about what's the point of doing these? And it's like, well, they have to work for the lineup that's doing them. And they have to be something that you can deliver and hopefully enjoy delivering, even if the song itself isn't a song you enjoy. Although I do enjoy Suspicious Minds.
And Tim, your band actually made it onto MTV during the day, big time, because of your cover of this LL Cool J song, That's a Lie. Also, really, your version of Seasons in the Sun, of taking this sort of old-timey musical tune and doing it all naughty and punk. Like, that was fairly influential on my approach.
Well, yeah, I mean, my band, Too Much Joy, actually began life conceptually as a cover band. The only reason we formed the band, it was three high school friends. You know, it was 1980, and we were sick of watching our classmates maul Led Zeppelin and Rolling Stones songs. And we're like, you know, why don't any of these bands play Clash tunes? It'd be so much better. And we sort of looked at each other, like, they don't seem that hard to learn. We could probably do it. So we literally, he took bass lessons, I took guitar lessons, just so we could play Clash songs at high school dances. And then we realized quickly, after actually succeeding in implementing that plan, we'd forgotten that the three of us were the only people in our high school who liked the Clash. So nobody had any idea what songs we were playing. And this was before Rock the Casbah. So we were like, well, if people are going to look at us confusedly and boo, we might as well be playing our own songs instead of cover songs. So we started writing our own tunes. But as you said, one of the things that made us semi-famous, I guess, we did a punk pop cover of LL Cool J's That's a Lie. We'd been touring around and we were just listening to that LL Cool J album radio in the van. And we kept remarking on how he was like the hip-hop Too Much Joy, how a lot of his songs sounded like Too Much Joy songs. And That's a Lie just seemed like if you put a couple of power chords against it, it would make a lot of sense. And it did. And he was in the video. And I don't know if that's why MTV played it during the day, back when they played videos. But we made it on the air with that. And the Seasons in the Sun cover, we weren't trying to like punk it up so much as we were trying to bring it back to its roots and restore the missing verse that Terry Jackson had excised, which made it a much more cynical and bitter tune than the sappy thing that those of us who grew up with it in the 70s grew up with.
PD, can you give us an opening statement here? Give us some taxonomy. We've already gotten out a few of the ideas from your book. I mean, the covers that Tim's talking about are reinterpretations. They're not trying to duplicate the original. Get us going.
One philosophical puzzle, or a puzzle that I think is philosophical about cover songs, is the fact that everybody likes to talk about how cover songs are dead and they're terrible and they hate them, but also musicians love to perform them and people love to listen to them. It's this simultaneous thing. And I think part of that, at least, is a conflation of what in the book and in work with collaborators I've called mimic covers on the one hand, the ones that are meant to just sound like the original as much as possible, and rendition covers on the other hand, where rendition covers aren't meant to sound as much like the original as possible. And rendition covers are complicated because they can head in all sorts of different directions. They can be pretty straight, or they can be wildly reinterpretive.
And the book gets into a lot of the history, which I thought Tim would probably have a lot of, as sort of a music scholar of soul and of stuff in the 60s. PD, you talk about how the term cover was put together as we're covering up the original, right? That somebody puts out something on their label. Let's make as close a copy as we can and try to market it heavier than theirs to literally squash them out. And we're all familiar with the stories of how that was done by white artists and white labels to make it unnecessary for white folks to go actually listen to the black stations or whatever. Or maybe they weren't going to do that anyway, but we need to somehow, it seemed exploitative. Whereas now it seems more worshipful, right? It's tribute bands. It's your favorite artists sharing their influences with you, or bands that are crappy bar bands pulling some genius from the culture so they could give you something that you can connect with. Whereas if they're just playing their originals, at least you as an audience might just crap on that.
I think covers now are complicated. Some of them are tributes, but some of them are meant to steal commercial share from other tracks. So there was a point at which Taylor Swift's tracks weren't on certain streaming services. And there were people who made sound-alike Taylor Swift tracks as covers, submitted them to the streaming service, and they knew that people searching for the Taylor Swift song would stumble onto theirs. And because Taylor Swift was a big enough deal, as a small-time operator, they could make what for them would be some serious money off of these kind of accidental click streams. And that's really just the old school, just making mimic covers to try and chisel off some of the market share from something bigger.
It goes well beyond Taylor Swift. In the aughts, when I was working at Rhapsody, one of the first on-demand music subscription services, there were outfits that specialized in identifying all the holes in streaming services catalogs. And basically any top 40 hit that wasn't yet in a service like Rhapsody or Spotify, more than one company would spring into action, create as close a version to it as they could. And we had to implement all kinds of policies about what you were allowed to name the artist, the quote-unquote artist and the quote-unquote song that were in the service. And it was all just to take advantage of people searching for these pop hits. Not necessarily like Taylor Swift, you know who Taylor Swift is, but like a band like Fun that has a top 40 hit, people don't know if they're listening to the original or not. And if it was closed, and Dylan was off the streaming services for a long time. So on YouTube, when his catalog was off of YouTube, there was a really, really skilled mimic who just specialized in putting up really, really sounded like versions of Bob Dylan tunes. And he got all the market share that Dylan would have had on YouTube for years as a result of doing that.
I mean, YouTube is still full of that. If I go search, even as we were prepping for this, if I go search YouTube for a version of a song, either an original or a cover or whatever, the search results often include covers, even when the original is right there from the artist. In fact, oftentimes the first result on YouTube is not the original artist's first party production of that song. It's, someone else's, even if it's someone else's upload of that song, it's not the original artist. And with YouTube being the number 2 search engine in the world, I'm certain that what you just described, Tim, was happening 20 years ago is absolutely still happening today.
Yeah, although I do think there's a distinction. I think what you're talking about, most of that is just fans paying homage to the artist they like and teaching themselves an instrument or hoping to get famous. But a very small percentage of it is the really deliberate, really careful mimicking of something
Fair.
In an attempt to disguise what it is and try to convince you that it's the real deal. But in terms of homages, just as a touring rock band, particularly in the early days, if we had like a frat show or just a show in some venue, particularly down south, where the crowd wasn't necessarily coming for us, they were just coming for a good time. You needed a repertoire of, you need to have your 20-minute version of Louie Louie and songs like Twist and Shout. They could morph into La Bamba and other things. There were literally nights when we would play. You'd walk in the club and the guy would say something like, I just need 2 straight hours of music. I don't give a shit what you play. You'd play 1 or 2 of your own songs, but mostly it was just songs that drunk people can dance to.
And I think, unless you achieve a certain level of fame, that just lurks forever. That I'm right now with my band working up new covers because there are places that we want to play, that if we just, even though we have 3+ hours of originals, that would not do it. So I get the idea. And I see that, as you were saying, Dave, I think, more on YouTube, that the people uploading these things, it's somebody who I want you to get into my music. So I'm going to record some covers and hopefully you'll be attracted to that. You'll like my version and you'll click on my channel and then hear all my originals. And, so that's basically the digital version of that gigging strategy.
There's two things to say about that, probably more than two, but two come to my mind. One is, as a band, there's a slippery slope that you are overlooking from a precipice, right? Where it's really easy to have this whole catalog of original songs and then to either placate a crowd or get into a certain place or both, you add some covers to your set. I've been in bands where over the course of time, and not a very long amount of time, the sets suddenly become 0 originals and all covers because it's just easy, right? It's low-hanging fruit.
And before you know it, you're Super Diamond.
Right, exactly.
You're exclusively a Neil Diamond cover band.
Right. Well, yeah, that would be the sort of the logical conclusion of that. But the middle ground is where it gets really murky, where you're just covering whatever it is you're covering with no real direction because you weren't a cover band out of the gate. So you never really thought about what do we want to do. A Neil Diamond tribute, that's a purpose-built thing. Most bands don't evolve into that. That's out of the gate, right? You say, this is what I want to do. But the bands that have been able to hold on to their original strategy of performing originals, no pun intended, history is full of those. You've got Van Halen, right? Everyone was introduced to Van Halen, if you were introduced to them in their early days, as a band that covered a Kinks song and lots of other songs, right? Ice Cream Man was a huge one for them, and most people don't even know that that's a cover, but yet it was. Dancing in the Street, those sorts of things. The Black Crowes were sort of the next one after Van Halen, and we could go back to the Beatles and the Stones if we really want to.
Yeah, they started as R&B cover bands before they started writing their originals.
Exactly, but they kept their focus and they didn't forget, even though, those 6-hour gigs in Hamburg were full of lots and lots of covers, but they sure learned how to sing well together, didn't they? Without monitors, but that's a whole other story. It can be done, but you have to hold on to that intention of being an original band, because unless you're Joe Cocker, you are not going to achieve, the level of fame that an original band can achieve just by playing covers. I don't know how Joe Cocker did it, to be honest.
It's not clear exactly why the word cover means what it means, but an original meaning is in the sense of coverage. That is, record companies made small runs, and so in the early days of recording, the song wasn't associated with a particular recording artist or a particular track. And so other companies would offer the same song with their artists as coverage. And in the same way, a live band learns the songs that their audience expects to hear from live bands in that setting. And that's less insidious or dark or kind of like slimy than trying to cover over the original. It's just you want to cover the things that people expect you to be able to do.
Most musicians start as fans. And when you're learning how to sing or teaching yourself an instrument, the natural starting point is to play stuff that somebody else wrote already before, because you have to teach yourself how to write as well. So there's this almost natural evolution where the majority of musicians start out playing other people's stuff, gradually start mixing in some of their own. The really, really skilled and talented ones then become known for their own stuff. But even as they reach the pinnacle of success and fame, everybody, the band and audience, gets a charge when they go back to their roots and play something that inspired them, either, from back in the day or something they like today. There's just always something cool about that shared communal moment as a fan or as a band when you're like, oh, they like that group too? I remember shortly after I moved to San Francisco going to see Wilco at the Fillmore. And the set was great, but the encores were amazing. They came out, I think they did I Want to Be Sedated by the Ramones. And then it was just like 8 or 9 covers in a row, basically playing all their influences that you wouldn't necessarily would think of, for this, at the time, alt country band. You wouldn't necessarily think they were coming from this punky place. I just love a good cover by a band playing something that's a little out of left field for them can just give you a lot of insight into where they came from and elements of their music that you might not have noticed sharing common DNA with some of this other stuff.
That's always interesting to me that, you go see a punk band or you go see a country band or a progressive rock band or whatever, and that band produces material in a specific genre. And yet it's so easy. I've experienced this, talking with fans in the crowd, pre-show or whatever. where they just can't even imagine that their favorite country band actually might like the Ramones or might be into Miles Davis. Like, yes, most bands produce material that can be somewhat pigeonholed, but the musicians' likes and influences are rarely so narrow. And you're right, hearing someone play a cover as they interpret it, and it might be straighter or interpretive depending on how they do it, can give you that insight and sort of open it up and be like, oh yeah, right, they're like me. They like all kinds of different music. And that's okay.
You reminded me, I was in, I think it was Cheyenne, Wyoming a couple summers ago, or it was last summer. And it was one of the first live gigs I'd seen, since the pandemic had started. Cheyenne's a small town, as far as I'm concerned, as like a New Yorker and a San Franciscan. But they were all excited the night I was passing through because a national touring act was coming through. And it was some country band. They were playing some roadhouse. I was like, I got to see a country band at a roadhouse. Not necessarily my cup of tea, but just for the experience, for the weirdest value, I figured I'd do it. I forget what they were called. I think it was the Eli Young Band, something like that. But this fairly popular pop country band. And it was just fun to see live music again. Again, it's not necessarily to my taste, but they ended their set with a cover of The Middle, that Jimmy Eat World song. And it was phenomenal. Everybody went batshit insane. Everybody was pogoing. It was a whole bunch of cowboys and cowgirls, literally with cowboy boots and cowboy hats on, pogoing to this pop punk song played by a country band in a roadhouse in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And just the mix of cultures and everything colliding, but everybody liking the same thing that was a little bit different. It was it's a treasured memory of mine. That was a great moment.
So that's always a good thing. Even in my most original bands, right? Most of the shows I did with Dave, throw in a couple covers as crowd pleasers, as a warm up, as an encore, stuff like that. I want to throw out Weezer as a band. Maybe it's because they're old, right? Because they're their 50s, that now,
that's not old, Mark. That's not old. I refuse to be part of anything that calls 50s old.
They're not in that young, I gotta get my originals out. I feel so passionate about the things that are tormenting me. Once you've sort of gotten that out of your system, and they're in a sort of unique position that they're successful enough, and the record business has changed such that it was, in the 60s, people put out records every year. By the 80s, 90s, it was like, oh no, we got to bring out the big marketing machine. So put out something every 3-4 years. It's got to be a real build up. And now with all that crap collapsing and nothing is profitable anyway, now a band like Weezer, if they want to, is just putting out something every year. And so a couple, 2 full albums, I believe, have been sheerly covers and purely rejoicing in music I like covers, the I being them. Some of it created pretty close to note for note perfect, but it's if you already like Weezer, if you like to hear Rivers Cuomo sing, then you'll like to hear him sing these things too. And I don't know, what do you think of that? Like, is that just too, I don't want to say self-indulgent, it's for an audience, but is there some point being missed there, or is this an all good thing?
There's a noble history of established acts paying tribute to their influences. Bowie's Pinups, it wasn't the first, but it was, that was a classic rock artist saying it's funny, he was only going back like 8 years or so to the songs that shaped him. It's not the greatest Bowie record. It's not the greatest version of some of those songs, but it's cool to listen to them. A lot of Bryan Ferry's solo albums are just his weird Euro trash version of old soul songs, or 60s pop hits, and a lot of Dylan covers for some reason. So in the rock world anyway, I feel like what Weezer's doing now is pretty common. And especially in the streaming era, I was in a record store, which is a rare thing to do these days. But in Portland, I just went to visit this big old record store, and I was just browsing like I do. And I found like 4 or 5 Lucinda Williams covers records that she'd put out. Apparently during the pandemic, she'd been doing these live streams. She did a soul night, she did a Dylan night, she did a Tom Petty night, and then they pressed them all up and, turned them into CDs. They hadn't been publicized very much, but I was like, I like Lucinda, I like soul music. I want to hear Lucinda doing a bunch of soul music songs. I'm buying this record. And I was like, oh, what the hell? I'll buy the Tom Petty covers as well. So I love it, but I'm a completist. When I love an artist, I need everything they've ever done. Then I need to find out who their influences are. And then I need everything they've ever done. So covers just hit my completist self in my sweet spot.
Because you're a fan of music, you want to know that the artists you like are also fans of music, and performing a cover from that angle, the angle that you started this thread with, Mark, really does feed that. It's like, okay, we're going to connect on a different level here because you like my music and that's great, but we both like that person's music. And so let's celebrate that together. And is it self-indulgent? I hope so, right? Like, I hope when I go see an original band and they choose a cover, I hope they're choosing it for themselves first. And not just because they think, oh, well, if we play Twist and Shout, we might sell more tickets the next time we're in this, in this market. Hopefully they're picking it because they love it and wanting to share that experience, because there is that shared experience. Even if, the four of us get together and none of us are playing music and we put on records, that would almost certainly bond us in new ways, right? I was playing a gig down in Boston at the Middle East a couple of weeks ago. And the sound engineer was, if he was 25, that was the maximum his age was. And he was great. We did our sound check. We got our, everything good to go. And then he put on Big Star's second album to play in the house. And I guess I heard it coming on. I was like, is he really playing Big Star? So I went up to him like, how do you know? Like, this is Big Star. Did you put this on? He's like, oh, I love this band. And it became this thing, right? And so music, shared interests, shared loves bond us. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I'll say I did a fair amount of, music writing and band interviewing in the 90s and aughts. And a lot of times musicians can be pretty prickly about talking about their stuff, or just bored because they've been asked the same question so many times and, they'll just fuck around with you. So I found the best way to have a productive conversation with a band that's in the middle of a press run is just talk about other bands, they like. And if you start there, then you can gradually get into their own music, and it's a much more natural conversation.
Although I think it's worth mentioning that people in the audience won't necessarily know the original, right? Even if the artist is performing it as this homage to this thing they think is great, there will be people in the audience who come to multiple shows and hear the same cover or more performances of the same cover. And for them, that becomes the canonical version of that song. I had a student come to office hours, I guess a little over a year ago. He'd just been in a conversation with several friends of his. So this is college age kids. And all of them had thought that the Johnny Cash version of Hurt was the original. He had this inkling that it wasn't, and he'd had to go to the internet. And I was like, yes, I know, right? It's just like, yeah, I'm aware. 9 Inch Nails, I've heard of them. Trent Reznor, heard of him. But it's the generational thing. For them, it's the one they've heard. It defines what the song should sound like.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It puts them in a different position with respect to appreciating the cover. For them, they're primarily appreciating it without that reference, without that homage.
The cultural version of that, to my mind, is Aretha Franklin's version of Respect, where almost nobody, very, very few people, would think of Otis Redding's version as the original at this point. It's just like Aretha Franklin's version so completely surpassed what Otis Redding was doing with that song that it really became her song. And you hear Otis do it and you're like, oh, he's covering, what a weird cover of Aretha Franklin's song that is. Whereas, with the Johnny Cash thing, it's like, oh, those young whippersnappers, they don't understand. So I find it amazing when a cover version of a song becomes not just more commercially successful than the original, but has longer lasting cultural impact.
And that impact was almost immediate, actually, because there's a capsule review of Stevie Wonder's version of Respect. He did a pretty straight rendition of Otis Redding's version. The capsule review in Billboard says that you could put it in a jukebox as an answer song to Aretha Franklin's song of the same name. Doesn't mention Redding at all.
Wow.
No internet.
We have a history of this happening to Otis Redding, right? Because when I was in high school, Hard to Handle was a Black Crow song. No one knew. I think it was when the Commitment soundtrack came out that people were like, wait a minute, this is not the Black Crows? It's like, no. But then there's songs that never, Otis Redding is an established artist and was an established artist, but there's those covers that become the canonical version, and that never changes, right? You've got Tainted Love, right? That's not a soft cell tune, but it really is a soft cell tune, right? it was never put into the public canon until Soft Cell did it, right? And so arguably, like Valerie, the Amy Winehouse, Mark Ronson cover, it's another one of those that I don't think will ever get recredited back to like the Zootons or whoever it was that did it.
So speaking of Otis Redding, you're making me think of Michael Bolton's Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, which I don't know if that eclipsed the original one, but that's one of those ones that it's kind of a straight cover. I don't remember the details of it, frankly, but other than people make fun of Michael Bolton, but it's a guy with a big voice trying to do this thing, but with updated production values, right? That people they're not going to be into Shondel's I Think They're Alone Now. So Tiffany will put out her up to the minute 80s version, and that will be a big hit. It seems like there's I don't know, what do you guys think of that whole people from the present day? They can't handle old technology. They can't handle listening to things from the 60s. So I need to put out a version. We'll put out Behind Blue Eyes by Limp Bizkit just to make it so the young people can actually get it.
Smash Mouth did it, right? With I'm a Believer. That became, I mean, it was in Shrek too, which really helped like send it to an audience. But that easily eclipsed for a demographic and for quite some time, and perhaps even still, the Monkees version. So,
although like production value and energy level can matter, like Joan Jett and the Blackhearts doing I Love Rock and Roll is just so much better than the Arrows. REM doing Superman is far and away better than the Clique.
Yeah, but nobody really knew the Clique other than the guys in REM.
When I went back to the original, I was like, oh, this is going to be great. And I listened to it. I was like, oh, man, what did they even hear in this? I got to say, this is embarrassing to admit, given how important soul music is to me now, but I was literally introduced to it by the Blues Brothers, right? Like Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi. My understanding is Dan Aykroyd was the real soul music fan. He turned John Belushi onto it, and then Belushi like went crazy with it. But, they introduced a whole generation of kids like me to this music that wasn't that old at the time. But to me, it was ancient history. And I never would have known who Donald Dunn was or who Steve Cropper was or anything about Fame or Stax or anything if it wasn't for fucking John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd being fans of the music and wanting to play it for other people.
And does that go back to Mark's point about Aykroyd and Belushi being white, covering black people's music? I mean, I realize it wasn't, I don't think, intended to be as terribly exploitative as the origins of the word cover, but it was still very much targeted at white audiences at a time when things were not necessarily happening that way.
MTV at the time wasn't playing black artists. They just weren't. So to me, it was less about, oh, we need to make this black music safe for white people. It was more about, oh, the milieu I was growing up in, the stations I was listening to or watching, they were never going to play this music. It needed some kind of ambassador to bring it to me. My understanding, at least, I could be wrong about this, but I think the folks that wound up in the Blues Brothers movie and wound up back in the band, like actually were appreciative of the fact that they were giving them, they were exposing them to a younger generation and a wider audience than the music was at risk of fading from the cultural memory to some extent.
It may well have faded if it weren't for the Blues Brothers. Like, that was a huge thing to happen to soul music.
Including some of the original artists in the movie as guests and things like this is all shows the intent. The paradigm of the exploitative thing is, so I don't know if Pat Boone is the best example, but that's at least the name that comes to mind of we need to make this black music less scary. We need to have recorded, not just have a white person mimicking a black person, but we need to actually change the tone and make it lighter. But that seems like a very distinctly 60s phenomenon.
I don't know how 60s it is, but there's definitely this sense of cultural appropriation we now feel is wrong. I remember back in the 80s, before the term really gained much currency, I went to see The Clash, the late version of The Clash, after Mick had been fired and Topper was a junkie and was no longer in the band. So it was this weird facsimile of The Clash. But Joe Strummer, before they launched into Police and Thieves, he started giving Sting and the Police shit for playing white reggae. And he said, this is how you do it, Sting. It's not about just like taking someone else's culture. It's about bringing some of your own culture to another culture. And then they launched into, their punked up version of Police and Thieves. And just like the Blues Brothers turned me on to old soul music, The Clash turned me on to reggae and dub that I might not have encountered otherwise, except for all the kids in my high school who loved Bob Marley, but that never really did it for me. But once I got turned on to Funky Kingston and Toots and the Maytals, things were different for me. I found that interesting at the time that I couldn't quite articulate what the difference was of the Clash incorporating their reggae influences into their music and the Police incorporating their reggae influences into their much more successful pop music. But Joe Strummer certainly saw a difference. And I don't think it's easy to define, but I think there's a moral difference between bringing some of your own to somebody else's stuff and just taking someone else's stuff.
The difference is that one of those bands had Sting as a lead singer.
Well, that's not just the difference, because...
No, I know. I was being reductive.
Let's stop for just a few minutes, talk about our sponsors. Before you book any brunch, you pore over lists and lists of reviews, so why not do the same when you're booking a doctor's appointment? With ZocDoc, you can see real, verified patient reviews to help find the right doctor in your network and in your neighborhood. After all, finding the right doctor is just as, if not more important, than finding the right plate of Eggs Benedict. ZocDoc is a free app that shows you doctors who are patient-reviewed, take your insurance, and are available when you need them. You can use ZocDoc to find any specialist under the sun. Whether you're trying to straighten those teeth, fix an achy back, or get that mole checked out, anything else, ZocDoc has you covered. ZocDoc's mobile app is as easy as ordering a ride to a restaurant or getting delivered to your house. Search, find, and book doctors with a few taps. And again, you can find and review local doctors. You read verified patient reviews from real people who made real appointments. So when you walked into that doctor's office, you're all set to see someone in your network who gets you. Go to ZocDoc.com, find the doctor that is right for you, book an appointment in person or remotely that works for your schedule. Every month, millions of people use ZocDoc. I have used ZocDoc. It is my go-to whenever I need to find and book a quality doctor. Go to ZocDoc.com/PMP and download the ZocDoc app for free. Then start your search for a top-rated doctor today. Many are available within 24 hours. That's ZocDoc.com/PMP. ZocDoc.com/PMP. It can be hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel when you have high-interest debt. Sometimes it can be even harder to ask for help, but that's where Upstart comes in. Upstart-powered personal loans can help you pay down high-interest debt like credit card debt, all online with simple and easy-to-understand payment terms. They have helped over 1.8 million customers on their path to financial freedom. So maybe you've got debts on a bunch of different cards. Maybe you have personal expenses you need to take. Upstart can get you one fixed monthly payment with a clear payoff date. Now, what if your credit score is not great? Well, Upstart knows you're more than your credit score, so rather than looking at just that, their model considers other factors like your income, employment, and other information provided in your loan application to find you a smarter rate for your loan. You can check your rate within minutes for loans between $1,000 to $50,000 without impacting your credit score, and you can receive funds as fast as one business day after accepting your loan. Don't wait. Check your rate today at upstart.com/pretty. That's upstart.com/pretty to check your rate today. Don't forget to use our URL to let them know we sent you. Loan amounts will be determined based on your credit, income, and certain other information provided on your loan application. Go to upstart.com/pretty.
Eric Clapton's cover of I Shot the Sheriff, which is later than the 60s. So this phenomenon is both occurred in the 50s as well as the 60s, but also occurred later. Again, to refer to, at the time, Billboard reviews, there's this really strange capsule review of Clapton's I Shot the Sheriff, in which they describe it as having the outlaw sound of the Cisco Kid. It's clear that they're not even catching on to like the kind of reggae influence on the way Clapton's playing. They hear it as this kind of like country and western thing. And that's a case where they miss a whole lot of what's going on because they don't get the reference. They don't get where it's coming from. I mean, in a way, it's not a reference. Clapton doesn't care if you're thinking of the original source for that song.
Yeah, he definitely made it his own.
Co-opting it, yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It became more of a country thing now that you mention it. Knowing that it comes from reggae, it's hard not to hear the reggae in it. But if you take that away and you just come in with beginner's mind, then yeah, sure, I guess.
But I think that's actually a mistake. You misunderstand deeply what's going on if you just come in with beginner's mind in that case.
Yes.
I like that phrase, beginner's mind. You know, now that I know more about the history of the music that I loved as a teenager, I go back and listen to a lot of records from the 80s. I'm like, oh, that's the reggae song on this record. But at the time, it was just new wave. It was all new wave to me.
Yeah.
PD's book has a whole chapter kind of on, do you have to get the reference? Do you have to have heard the original? And of course, I mean, music is supposed to be, there's probably a technical term, multivalent, that is open-ended in a way that not just in its meaning that people can get different things out of it. I don't want to explain my lyrics. I want people to get what they want to get out of it. But even just the tone and the sociology of it, of like a really popular, The Cars was my favorite band in high school. And I pointed you guys out a version of Just What I Needed, perhaps at least what I considered their best song for a long time, by Poison, that I just detest because I don't like Poison and I don't like their style, their attitude. But there was something ambiguous about The Cars that they could appeal to, sort of like, I'm a young nerd, and there's some of them look nerdy and they have tweaky keyboards. And so I can kind of project that teenage alienation, my version of that, onto them. But they're also, the reason that they got so famous is because they could appeal to the stoners and the cool crowd. So Poison takes an aspect of that sociology. They play the song straight. They play it competently. They leave out the keyboards, and I no longer like it because it's like they strip the attitude. It's like, because I don't like them as human beings, not because I don't like them.
I was going to say, you almost want to be able to come into the Poison cover of that with beginner's mind and not having the baggage of what you know about Poison. I don't have that baggage about Poison. And when I played that version, I'm like, actually, this is pretty, like, it's fine.
It seemed to me like it flattened out all the interesting phrasing from the original, though. Like, it's like they quantized all the phrasing.
Fair. Yeah, fair. Sure. I mean, they made it a Poison.
They didn't do it digitally, but they just, like, delivered it flat.
They delivered it like Poison delivers.
Yeah, and it isn't a great song if you deliver it like Poison.
Well, that's an interesting thing, right? Like, the nuance, covering a song, the ability and the skill that can be developed with intention of going after the nuances that are important to preserve. The Escape, right? The Pina Colada song is a fantastic example of this, because I've seen bands cover it and it's just like flat. And then I watched a video of Rupert Holmes, right? Yep. I have the right Rupert in mind. Okay. I wanted to say Rupert Hine, but that's the producer. So Rupert Holmes performing it, and the phrasing of each line and how each chorus not only has different lyrics, but is phrased differently and notes are held for different lengths. And he was conducting his backup singers through these to like cut them off at the right times, because evidently they weren't as rehearsed as he would have preferred. But watching him do that, it was like, right, this is the key to that song, because that song, when it was recorded, they didn't have budget to have the whole band come in and track it. So they had recorded 32 bars of that song and just looped it. Then they had Steve Jordan come in when they knew it was going to be a hit. They had Steve Jordan come in and play a second drum track on top of it to give it some flow. But the guitar line, everything else is just 32 bars, copy paste until the song's over. But it's his vocal delivery and the lyrics too. I mean, they're sort of universal, right? But his vocal delivery makes it what it is and gives it that lift and those peaks and valleys that if you just put the paper in front of you and read it, it just comes across flat. So there's a skill in that.
There are cover versions that do the reverse, that take what seems like a flat, one-dimensional song and reveal nuance in it. And a lot of times you go into them assuming they're an ironic cover. I'm thinking of like when Aztec Camera did Van Halen's Jump, and they turned that, party song into, a tender folk rock ballad, basically. And then you listen to it and you're like, no, I think he actually just realizes it's a good song. I don't think he's joking with this cover of Jump. He's just like, this is a composition that's like, actually, I can do a bit more justice to than the composer did.
Sorry, PD, you mentioned Superman, the REM cover. I was exposed to that, as I'm sure many, many people were, as an REM song. I had no idea it was a cover for many years. And then, like Tim, I'm a completist. If I'm into a band, I want to know all the things. And so I dug and stumbled on the fact that this was a cover and wanted to hear the original, and then realized, as we said earlier, oh, wait, REM found some nuances in this that were buried by the way the original was created. And thank goodness they did, because they made it into the song that it could be. They realized this song's potential in a way that the original artist, at least on the day they recorded it, did not.
What was your experience then with King of the Road?
Oh,
So REM's version is just famously drunken, and they even write in the liner notes like, "We're really sorry, Roger. Please don't kick our asses." Something like that.
I think perhaps because of the liner notes, I knew that was a cover and a drunken one at that. So I never took it as, it was not a surprise to me that was a cover. I think I knew that right out of the gate. But
you know who has a great cover of King of the Road, though? Roger Miller from Mission of Burma on a solo album does just this really cool keyboard version of King of the Road. It's all like, Mac keyboards and stuff. It sounds super weird, but I like it as much as the original.
Wait, his name is Roger Miller covering a Roger Miller? Or did you?
Yeah. No, it's Roger Miller covering a Roger Miller song.
All right. I was wondering about that too. But to tie it all together, REM did an awful cover of the Academy fight song that never really saw the light of day, thank goodness. But it did expose me to Mission of Burma, so that was a good path, right?
I think this is actually one of the complexities of evaluating rendition covers, is that sometimes they can be really great for ways that they diverge from the original, like they take it in a different direction. But sometimes part of the way that they can be great is recognizing what's important to keep from the original. So it's not like just change is good, nor is it the case that following the original is good. It's having some sensitivity to which bits matter.
Yeah, it's that self-awareness of what attracted me to this song in the first place. Let's make sure our prime directive is let's preserve that. These are the sacred cows in this song. And then the rest would just let come out however they want to come out through our way of doing it, either intentionally or accidentally. And magic doesn't always happen.
Although I'm gonna go back to Seasons in the Sun here, because my band covered that, and the reason we covered it was I had found, it's hard to say what's the original with this song. I had found what I considered the original at the time when I was in college. There's a Rod McEwen album called Seasons in the Sun. So I knew Rod McEwen as this like kind of trashy, mass market quote unquote poet that had, hugely selling paperback books of his atrocious poetry. I hadn't realized he was also a spoken word artist and a singer. And this album had testimonials on the back from Phyllis Diller and Vincent Price, which is what made me spend the $5 on it. It's like, I have to hear Rod McEwen's version of Seasons in the Sun. And I listened to it, and it's so weird. It's like, it's with this weirdly strummed acoustic guitar. It's sort of like this beat poetry version of it. But most importantly, it has this third verse that Terry Jacks left out of his 14 million selling pop hit of the 70s, where you realize that the guy singing it, the guy who's dying, is not singing this maudlin song about how much he's going to miss his wife and friends and kids. It's how bitter he is that his wife cheated on him with his best friend, and he's going to haunt them from the afterlife. And I just thought that was amazing and so much better and so much greater than the Terry Jacks version. And I came to find out Ron McEwen's version was a semi-cover because he took a Jacques Brel song that was written entirely in French, and he said he just translated it and sort of like cleaned it up for American ears. But actually, he completely bowdlerized the Brel tune, which was even more cynical than Rod McEwen's. But the weird thing is, like, 10 different people did covers of Seasons in the Sun in the 60s. So Rod McEwen wrote the English version. The Kingston Trio did a version. There was this British band, I forget their name. The Beach Boys did a version they never released. The Terry Jacks produced. He knew the song would be a hit, and he was trying to get them to do it. And when he couldn't get them to release their version, he recorded his own. But he made a fundamental change, which I'm convinced is what's prevented all the other songs from ever being hits. He took out the cynical verse and he replaced it with a verse he wrote that was even more maudlin than the first two verses. So basically what he realized was people just wanted to weep and cry, and they didn't want an ironic twist at O. Henry twist at the end. And I'm convinced that him taking out what I thought was the thing that made the song important and good was actually what made it this world-conquering smash.
So whether you're retaining or injecting or finding the emotion in something like that, if we want to generalize. So some of my favorite covers are ones like the Peter Gabriel Scratch My Back album. So it's like, I don't know, again, a guy who's old enough, maybe he doesn't have that many original songs bubbling that he has to get out, but approach these covers with like fully as much creativity as you would an original. And so took a song like Heroes or one of the Paul Simon songs, The Boy in the Bubble, that was fast in its original version, and found the despair in them and, beautiful slowed down despair I also sent you guys The Residents, sort of known purely, even their originals. Is it music? It's a deconstruction of music. It's some kind of avant-garde thing. And so they did a whole album of Elvis covers that is just to show what a sad, pathetic individual Elvis was, and just really get at the grit in it. That's an interesting, whether, it's not that I want to listen to that Residence album multiple times. Like, it's sort of a performance thing. It's not necessarily something I want to sit with in the way that I do the Peter Gabriel one. But in both cases, I feel like that often it's a meditation on the song and what its inner meaning is to you or something like that. And I don't know, maybe that's just my intellectual take on it. That to me has a reason to exist. Of course, there's a function for like, well, the original artist isn't here and we're in a bar together, so I'm going to play you these songs. Like, that's totally legitimate, such that in that setting, you could say, if you're in a bar band, to go back to where we started, and you're playing your originals, well, that's very self-indulgent of you. The audience doesn't really want to hear that. Like, what, the fact that utilitarian, that you could use that to rip on cover songs, but at least it has a purpose. Whereas the delivery of a particular original at a particular time, may have less of a purpose. To wrap up, what are you actually looking for in a good cover?
I am fortunate to be playing in original bands again, and one of them, Bitter Pill, is doing fairly well. We end most of our shows with our cover of Minnie the Moocher, which is, a 100-year-old tune. And we play it because people come to hear our songs, and it's been spectacular. In fact, especially over the last year, there's just more and more people showing up that know the lyrics, but we don't know who they are, and it's wonderful, right? But that moment with Minnie the Moocher, and we have some other tunes that we do this with too, but it ties everyone in the room together in a way that is specifically not self-indulgent. It's not like, hey, we know you came to hear us and we know you know the lyrics to our song, so we're going to play our song and we'll celebrate that together because it's ours. This is, we're taking ourselves out of it. We're just having this moment of bonding of everyone in the room. And yes, we're the ones playing the song, but everybody's really singing along, and it becomes this immersive, collective community experience that is quite wonderful. And so I think of covers in their best use as that. There's other uses that are fine. I don't mean to condemn all other uses. Like wedding bands have a very specific use for covers. And it would be, I have actually played weddings in an original band, but that's a very specific thing. It, generally speaking, you want covers, and that's fine too. That serves a purpose because the original artists aren't available to play your wedding, sir. That's how that goes. But yeah, that to me, a fantastic use of covers is exactly that, just to tie the audience and musicians and tie the room together in a way that is not self-indulgent.
I would echo that. I think there's three possible things I could get from a good cover experience. The first is just turn me on to something I didn't know already. That's what the Blues Brothers did. That's what a lot of bands that I love do. The second, if I do know the song, is show me something in the song that I missed, that you have insight into, and make me see it in a new light. And the third is what Dave's mentioning, just, let's have a communal experience where we bond over our shared love of the same object. And if you can do more than one of them at a time, even better.
I'd just add, though, I think there's an important thing covers can do, which is the same thing in an original song, a performance of an original song could do. It's just like there's some immediate, this is awesome to listen to. When somebody finds a way to make a cover and perform it, and it's awesome to listen to, all the reference, all of the history can be important. There's a level of value in that. But there's also just some value in listening to it as its thing, which is not like because it's a cover, but just because it's a performance or a recording of a song.
Yeah. So in other words, the same qualities that you would apply to any other thing go to the cover.
Right. It's not like making it a cover makes it no longer able to carry that kind of immediate aesthetic awesomeness that a really good track or performance can have.
So I was looking through a lot of playlists and articles and things about cover bands. Willie Nelson is another guy who you just like, if you're a Willie fan, you just like his voice, and he could kind of sing the phone book, as they say. You could sing anything. So he covered Paul Simon's American Song,
American Tune. Yeah.
American Tune. There you go. And the particular voicing of that, I've observed this, like, it's a very personal kind of like, here are my philosophical thoughts about things from Paul Simon. That for me, that kind of song, I don't care how wonderful Willie's voice is. I don't want to hear that coming out of anybody else's mouth. Like, so if as a locution, it is fight the power, like if it is something that is sort of meant to be spread, meant to be viral, then making that into a cover, absolutely natural. If it is some very specific thing about the individual's life or observations, then it seems just weird to do it as a cover. I don't like that.
We had this conversation on Gig Gab recently about covering rap songs, because so many rap songs are very personal. The lyrics to them, the poetry, and then whatever you want to call that, is very personal to the original artist. And yet we had, of all the topics we've had in the last, in 7 years, that's definitely top 5 in terms of listener feedback. And we heard from so many bands that are like, no, it's totally fine to cover a rap song. You just can't do it with your tongue in your cheek. You have to own it and deliver it as though for what it is. You don't have to act like it's yours.
As a dramatic monologue.
Yes, correct. It's a dramatic monologue. Yeah, it's performance art that someone else wrote, and we're all acknowledging that someone else wrote it. But I'm going to deliver it in a meaningful way. And they say it works out great. So
it's also interesting you give American Tune as the example, because I was a big Simon and Garfunkel fan in high school. I owned the complete works, or the complete Simon and Garfunkel. I didn't own the complete Paul Simon, so I hadn't heard American Tune before I picked up Across the Borderline when it was new, which is the album that the Willie Nelson version is on. I later heard the Paul Simon version. I love the Paul Simon version, but I also love the Willie Nelson version. I think Across the Borderline is a great album, just like all the songs on there are really great versions. So I actually disagree about that specific example, because for me, even though I was a fan of Paul Simon, I encountered the Willie Nelson version of American Tune first. There are these big poetic images of the Statue of Liberty sailing away to sea, which I don't know what the hell Paul Simon was thinking when he wrote that, but it's like people can put kind of a different spin on that. I think that's a song that carries really well over to covering.
I think we cannot leave without saying at least a little about naughty covers, disrespectful covers, something I think often it is not really clear. So like Cake's version of I Will Survive, which I love. Is that making fun of the original? Is it participating in the original? I've had people say, look, they just couldn't write a song as good as the original. And so this is why you're going to enjoy it. And I kind of maybe like it better than most Cake songs. Also, their version of Guitar Man, I like quite a bit better than the original version, or, the previous version of that. Yeah. And I've done versions myself. Like, I think I covered, Dave, did we do Raspberry Beret together? I don't know. I've done that in subsequent bands.
I think we did it a la the Hindu Love Gods, which was 3/4 of REM plus Warren Zevon. I remember doing that in some band. I can't remember if that was with you or not, but yes.
Right. Or I shared with you a version of Billie Jean. And I don't think these are parodies exactly, but they are, I'm not going to try to sing like a soul singer or whatever. So I guess they're cross genre.
What about Tom Jones' cover of Kiss? The first time I heard that, I didn't know if he was a Prince fan or if he was poking fun at it, because it's Tom Jones. Everything's tongue in cheek.
Or take John Coltrane's version of My Favorite Things, which completely explodes the song, takes it in an entirely new direction. But the fact that he's taking the most white bread tune you can possibly imagine from The Sound of Music, and, this black experimental jazz musician is turning it into something completely different. It's not a respectful take on the song, I don't think. But it's transcendent. I don't think he's paying homage to the song. I think he's basically trying to deconstruct it.
Interesting. I always heard that as he loved the melody and saw different things that you could do while using just the melody as the framework. I never stopped to think that it might have been not that at all.
When you're talking about disrespectful covers, though, I think to circle back to something that came up early, Aretha Franklin's cover of Respect is a repudiation of the Otis Redding version. I mean, the Otis Redding version is misogynistic and demand on his woman. And the Aretha Franklin version, it becomes an anthem because it's everybody deserves respect. I deserve respect. It's not sort of instrument of oppression in the same way that the Otis Redding version was.
Yeah, we should explain this just because I had not actually heard the Otis Redding version of this before this conversation. And the Otis Redding version is, when I come home, I want respect from you, woman.
I want my dinner.
Right. And also, please don't cat around and have affairs with other people while I am in town. Like, it gives gives his woman permission to cuckold him, provided he is on tour. But when he's in town, she should not. It's it's Aretha's version, even though it's musically similar and picks up a lot of the lyrics, is in some ways an answer song to Otis Redding's. Like, she adds lyrics that make it the character she's singing as responds to the Otis Redding character.
Which feeds into the review you mentioned earlier of Stevie Wonder's cover of Otis's thing, which they saw backwards, but, you know.
Yeah.
I love the Jonathan Colton version of Baby Got Back. It is just such a pretty song. PD, your book talked about an equivalent one.
The Richard Cheese version of these songs, because that's a whole other thing. Just taking songs and turning them into lounge songs.
Oh, are you talking about a cappella versions of...
Yes, Ben Folds covering
Dr. Dre.
Yes,
Bitches Ain't Shit. Yeah.
Which I'm not sure. I think there maybe, I can't speak to the original of the Dr. Dre in terms of what Dave was saying about rap, but Baby Got Back is not a personal piece.
No.
Like, it is a joke song in the first place. So making it a different joke, totally fine. Nothing.
In fact, that was one of the more frequently mentioned rap songs that was great to cover from all the email that we got about that topic. Mm-hmm. So.
Or perhaps my personal ultimate and disrespectful cover versions is Sid Vicious doing My Way.
Sure.
Which, if you think about it, is a punk rock cover of My Way is the best way to honor a song with the lyric of My Way. But I do not believe Frank Sinatra was pleased.
Wow. But that wasn't the intent, was it?
Yeah.
So
he was not seeking Frank Sinatra's approval.
Can we close down here with one more go around, just with something that we have not mentioned yet, a particular idiosyncratic favorite cover of yours? PD, start us with what is the most important thing we have not yet brought to the table.
I don't know that it's the most important thing. You said idiosyncratic favorite. Yes. In the course of researching this book, I have to say YouTube was great. I mean, this book would have been hard to write before I could just find a whole bunch of covers online. But one cover that haunted me it was an earworm that stuck with me for days, was REM's cover of First We Take Manhattan by Leonard Cohen. It's not a universal favorite, but for me, it just haunted me for a long time after I listened to it. So I'll offer that.
Dave,
I think I got all of the things that were important to me, and with the possible exception of the cover song that actually helped the original artist. And a great example of that is Desperado. The Eagles wrote it and recorded it, but of course it was Linda Ronstadt who actually made that song popular because people didn't like Eagles' version or didn't care about it, perhaps is a better way to say it. But they cared a lot about Linda Ronstadt's version. But then that opened the door for a fairly decent career for the Eagles from that point forward. And I'm understating their career, of course.
Yeah. Tim, do you have one more to pull out of your hat?
Well, since you just mentioned Linda Ronstadt, I'm going to mention Linda Ronstadt cover of, any Linda Ronstadt cover of a Warren Zevon song. She's what brought me to him, way back in the day. So I have a soft spot for those. That said, as much as I love her version of Poor, Poor, Pitiful Me, it's a completely different song than when Warren Zevon sings it. Because when she sings, Oh, These Boys Won't Let Me Be, she's serious. She's like, oh, these boys won't let me be. I'm Linda Ronstadt. When Warren Zevon sings Poor, Poor, Pitiful Me, dude literally wants to die and is making fun of his own death wish.
So my closing recommendation, you mentioned Big Star, Dave, and that is, I'm definitely in the little cult of Alex Chilton. There was a new thing that I just discovered researching today, that they just released a 1975 EP that Chris Bell had engineered. And I had not heard this, 5 songs, sloppily done, incomplete. So, we clutch at straws from this man. And he put out an album called Clichés that opens with My Baby Just Cares for Me, this classic, which I wasn't, had never really heard the original. And that particular version just stuck with me, remains one of my favorite songs, my favorite versions. And it's just because there's something about this guy's voice and his damaged, goofy, lovable personality that just like hearing him do that song. And he has, What's Your Sign, Girl? He has Oogum Boogum. He's really somebody that gave up on his own songwriting at some point. And he just was very self-deprecating, even though he did this sort of genius level stuff, acknowledged as such in the early 70s, just kind of oh, I'm just going to punk around and play covers and it'll be fine. So just hearing the essence of that, I would recommend for folks. Well, thanks for all of you for participating in this. Anybody that has a few more minutes, we might record some more supporter material just to maybe PD if we could talk about a couple more actual points from your book. But mostly it's such an easy book to read and it's free. So we will, look at the blog post associated with this episode and we will link right to it. Open Book Publishers put it out. And I don't think it was necessarily the best use of our time. I would have been okay if us just kind of walking through it chapter by chapter, but you could read the whole thing in a couple days and they should get that out of it themselves.
Well, thanks for having me.
Same. This was great. I love this. That I could sit here. Yes. It's easy. It's obvious we could all easily sit here for like 3 more hours because as you mentioned, Alex Chilton and Big Star again, it was like, oh, I have like 4 more things that I could share that just spring from that, which is great. Like that's that communal, bonding over this shared shiny thing that we all like. So.
All right. And Tim, plug your new album.
Well, there's a new album coming out in October, but the most recent one that you can still buy today, is called Mistakes Were Made. It came out last year and has no covers on it.
But it's sweet anyway. All right. Thanks, listeners.